Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping. If you could please smash the like button if you enjoy the content, it really goes a long way, helps us out with the algorithm. I seem to be making a little bit of a habit of this, but I do want to point out that the referee definitely played a role in this game. He definitely wanted to stamp authority on this game, stamped out dissent, and generally made it very difficult for Arsenal to be able to get tight to the Barcelona players. With that, it also feeds into the way that Barcelona play. So cynically, Barcelona will pull you by the shoulder when you get past them. That tends to be a lot smaller of an action. It's a little bit more innocuous, very difficult for the referee to be able to judge. Please look in the description if you want to see a full summary of the tactics. I won't be able to go into all of them just to try and keep this video as short as possible. With that, let's talk about some of the better things that Barcelona did. So typically overloading the right hand side, constantly having Torrejon, the right back, overlap Graham Stephan, the right winger. That makes it extremely difficult for Catley, the left back, to pick who she should track. So does she go with the fullback who's overlapping, and then potentially the fullback receives the ball in a dangerous position, or does she go with Hansen instead? And Hansen obviously wants to come inside and get into a potential shooting position more centrally. It was extremely difficult for Catley to be able to make that choice just because of how quickly the Barcelona players interchanged and how many of them typically came over to that side. One of the things they were thinking involved with having Makaya best left winger was to try and protect Catley a little bit against this, but Barcelona's numbers in this zone of the pitch made it really difficult for Catley to be able to pick a position where she wouldn't be exposed by the run of either Hansen or by runs by maybe Bonmati, potentially by Putellas, both of those two playing as free eights, and then also the fact that you have Caldente come off her left wing position and roam almost like a number 10, typically over towards that right hand side as well. Okay, so this being another example of Barcelona creating that right hand side overload, I quite like this just because it shows part of Arsenal's press. So when Arsenal could, they would try and have their far-sided wide midfielder pull into more of a centre forward kind of position and try and help press Barcelona up against the touchline and allow a longer switch of play for Barcelona towards their free fullback. In this situation, the free fullback being Torrejon, for most teams in the WSL, this would probably be a little bit of a problem. They might not really have the technical ability at the back to be able to pull off this switch of play, but for Barcelona, it wasn't an issue. I think this is also a good example of how Arsenal's midfield worked. So typically they would all try and push across and try and help cover and compress the space on the side where Arsenal were trying to create their press. So roughly in that zone over there, they would be trying to really help the wide midfielders and fullback compress the space, as the fullback as well for Arsenal would typically try and press the fullback of Barcelona, who was staying relatively high and wide. Barcelona almost used the press that Arsenal had, where they had their far-sided wide midfield and narrow, actually to try and help them, because it meant now that they had a little bit more space on the right-hand side when they finally did get there. I think this scenario here that we have with Barcelona set up on the right-hand side really demonstrates what they were looking for. I believe this is Putellas, and then you've got Hansen making kind of like an underlapping run, and she's trying to get into the space here. Obviously she's excellent one-on-one dribbling. You have a lot of support here for Catley, so Manon was doing this throughout the game, but then also you have Cabe, who's meant to be the left winger, as well as also Little coming across to try and help just shore up this side. But it didn't matter to Barcelona. They were happy for you to all come across there because one of you will be lax for a brief moment and Graham Hansen will get in behind. Okay, so typically here I'd want to talk a little bit about Barcelona's deep build-up, but they didn't actually have to do that much of it for a number of reasons. So I think two significant obstacles for why I didn't get to see very much of Arsenal's press, at least in the first half and the first 50 minutes or so, was due to how quickly Panos would just throw the ball out and get Barcelona playing again, didn't really let Arsenal set their press up. And two, taking it back to the referee, whenever Arsenal tried to press in any, whether it was an open play or from a Barcelona goal kick, she was really quick to blow her whistle and Barcelona would have an easy way out. Following on from our brief mention of Arsenal's press earlier, they did try and press intensely off pass back. So we talked about the fact that when Barcelona went towards a channel, which they often did, we talked about, that they typically want to overload on one side. Whenever they did that, then the far-sided wide midfielder, so when they came over to their right-hand side, then you're going to have Mead come to more of a centre-forward position or take up her typical counter-pressing position, which we showed when Arsenal played Chelsea at the beginning of the season. Typically Arsenal in that shape would try and press intensely on pass backs if they could obviously force Barcelona into a pass back, which is very difficult. These players have an exceptional passing IQ where they're just constantly moving for each other, able to really shift Arsenal's players around. And I think this is a really great example of what we just mentioned before, where Barcelona use the shape that Arsenal are pressing in actually against them. So you see here where eventually the ball is going to be passed out towards Barcelona's right hand side, and there's just not going to be that much cover for Catley. So whilst Barcelona didn't build up that often deep in the first half, in the second half they did at times, and they typically set up in this 2-4-2-2 versus Arsenal, who set up in a 2-4-1-3. Arsenal would have their centre-backs pair up against the wide midfielders of Barcelona. So at this point you've got Lieke Martens on the left hand side, you've got Graham Hansen, and they're basically playing as inside forwards. Think of Liverpool's men's team with Salah and Mane, and then you have freer roles for the likes of Bonmati as well as also Caldente to just try and get into positions to pull apart the Arsenal press and find ways to get the ball high up the pitch as direct as possible in for the runners of Barcelona. Of course, Arsenal weren't just sitting back while all this was happening around them, although maybe it felt like that to some Arsenal fans, and they set up with a 2-4-1-3. You've got Leo Walty, your centre defensive midfielder, pushing up and tracking the runner, in this case Caldente, and you've got your forwards of Arsenal trying to force the Barcelona defenders into just rushing a pass really, and maybe Arsenal capitalising on a mistake. Of course, with any press that's this aggressive, there's always going to be space in behind, and that's basically what Barcelona were looking for. We talked about that with their very high and relatively narrow positioning of their wide midfielders. Given how aggressively positioned the fullbacks are for Barcelona in possession, obviously Arsenal, when they tried to counter, did try and play through the channels and try and have their fullbacks get up and try and support. On occasions where those attacks broke down, Arsenal, if they had them players committed, so obviously you've got your fullbacks already high up as well, they try to counter press. Okay, so this is a slight variant on the Arsenal 2-4-1-3 press. At this point, you have Iwabuchi on the pitch. Unfortunately, she doesn't quite have the legs to keep up the intensity of the press. So what they did was they had her almost move to a centre forward role so that the likes of Nikita Paris and Heath could try and cover the large spaces that Iwabuchi wouldn't be able to cover if she was put into, I guess, what would be her more natural wide midfielder position. This kind of exemplifies the shape that we were talking about before with the 2-4-2-2. It's not quite as pronounced as it was with Caldente, where Caldente was literally in a centre midfield position. Here we have Mariana, number 19 for Barcelona. She did drop deeper as well when they tried to build up out of the back, and typically you're going to have Lieke Martens and Graham Hansen trying to run in behind off the deeper build-up. So this being the next stage of the play, you've got Arsenal players having tried to collapse on the ball as it's passed from the centre-backs into a centre midfielder. You've got Mariana dropping kind of almost false nine, pulling a centre-back out for Arsenal, and just generally creating space for the likes of Lieke Martens to be able to try and exploit, which she immediately capitalises on. Whilst Barcelona didn't really create clear-cut chances from their short corners, I do think it's worth mentioning them. They were constantly trying to create new angles for in-swinging crosses, as well as also maybe getting towards the touchline and trying to create a cutback, kind of similar to what Oshoala did when she set up Putellas earlier on in the game. So in this situation, we have BG take the short goal kick, and she passes it out wide to the centre defensive midfielder, Leo Walty, who's actually stationed in a right-back position. This makes it extremely difficult to be able to pick up. As soon as the ball is played out to Leo Walty, then you see Caldente, who's in her left wing position, left midfield position in the 4-4-2 that Barcelona typically used in their press. At other points in the game, Barcelona did use a 4-1-4-1, and they also had what looked like a 4-1-3-2. Again, some of the shapes that Barcelona used, I think were just more a case of coincidence, and it was more that they were just tracking players and seeing shapes in them. But overall, I would say that they used a 4-4-2 shape versus Arsenal's deep build-up. I'm assuming that part of the reasoning of Arsenal's deeper build-up was to draw Barcelona higher up the pitch, try and get the defensive line as high as possible, so that when Arsenal inevitably kicked the ball long, there was more space for the likes of me to be able to exploit, the likes of me, De Mar, etc. Okay, so here we have another example of Arsenal with their deep build-up. Except here we actually have Leo Walty in a more traditional position, and she's also flanked by her centre midfield partners in Little and Manham as well. And so Barcelona are able to take a little bit more of an aggressive pressing position. So whilst we can see that they have two forwards putting pressure on the centre-backs of Arsenal, you actually have a little bit more of a fluid midfield now. So you have their midfielders actually kind of tracking the centre midfield of Arsenal, as we mentioned earlier. We've had Mead pull into more of a central position just to try and drag the left back, I'm not even going to try and pronounce her name, more narrow and closer to the centre back, and try and create a little bit more space for Moritz, who's pushed really high up the pitch. Excuse me, this is Moritz, with Mead actually being the one hugging the touchline and flicking the ball onto Moritz. And just like the Arsenal fullbacks being aggressive versus the Barcelona fullbacks when they received it in wide spaces, the Barcelona fullbacks were really aggressive, tracking Arsenal forwards dropping. This is something that they continued on in the second half as well, once Arsenal made their plethora of changes. Okay, so clearly a big part of Arsenal's plan was to try and get in behind the very high line of Barcelona. So as well as their long balls from deep for the forward line of Arsenal to try and get on the end of, they also tried to progress it through the thirds and have forwards drop, pulling the Barcelona defenders higher up the pitch and creating space in behind them, while centre midfield runners or third woman runners try to exploit the space that those Barcelona defenders had just vacated. So in this scenario, we can see Miedema, who's dropped to try and support deeper build-up, and then you also have Beth Mead, who's dropping to try and link play, whilst you have centre midfield or third woman runners in Manum as well as Little, who are going to run in behind and try and take advantage of the Barcelona defenders who are trying to track the forwards of Arsenal who are dropping. So whilst this play does break down, it's another good example of Arsenal trying to pick up the pieces of the play, with a lot of their forwards trying to just put pressure on the short options that Panos has. So eventually Arsenal make just numerous substitutions. You end up with Nobbs as centre defensive midfield. So you have a full reshuffle of the forward line. You end up with Nikita Paris, Ford and Tobin Heath. And obviously with that, Arsenal's style of play has to change. So we mentioned how Arsenal earlier in the game had this 2-1 or 2-3 shape, with Leah Walty kind of pulling out towards that right hand side, that right back position. Instead, after the substitutions, we actually had Leah Williamson kind of break past the lines of Barcelona's press. At this point they were pressing in a 4-3-2 or a 4-1-4-1 shape. If Williamson wasn't stepping out with the ball, then you could also try and progress the ball from the defensive to the middle third with Manum's runs. So you'd have the ball passed across the back line towards the left hand side, towards Catley, and as this is happening, you're going to have Manum pick up a head of steam and try and run kind of, I guess, parallel up the pitch, such that as Barcelona's players are coming across, Manum isn't really picked up, and you can, as long as you keep the ball moving relatively quickly, pass it into her and she can just receive the ball in stride, break the lines, and then you can pass it into potentially Tobin Heath or maybe Ford, etc. So this is a great example of what I was just describing, but it gives an idea of kind of the positionings that I was trying to get at. So you can see with Manum here what I was trying to get at with where she's positioned, how she becomes a little bit of a problem for the Barcelona's defence when they try and press. Just as Barcelona were trying to exploit the right hand side and the kind of difficulty you can find in defending a lot of fluidity, you had Arsenal trying to take advantage of Barcelona's fullback stepping out by trying to have third woman runners run into the space that was vacated by Torrejon. The plan for Arsenal at this point was to kind of keep up the same dynamism. You've got a lot of relatively quick players on in Ford, in Nikita Paris and Tobin Heath, but also putting a lot of onus on the very experienced, the very decorated Heath to try and create, and then eventually when Uruchi came on, then she was also looking to be a little bit of a 10, floating around and trying to pick up little pockets of spaces where she could maybe slip a ball through for the runners of Arsenal, or maybe get into a crossing position. Against any high possession team, the team with low possession must counter-attack whenever they've got the chance, and Arsenal tried to do that. They did struggle, I would say, just because Barcelona are really good at counter-pressing, and Arsenal, I think, made a lot of poor choices when it came down to key moments of counters. So with this counter-attack, we see Manum get onto the ball, Barcelona obviously counter-pressing, and unfortunately Manum doesn't pick the right direction to take the ball, and that automatically kills the counter-attack. Really, if she'd been able to try and keep the momentum of the counter-attack going and was able to play it towards this left-hand side, Arsenal would be able to break up into the free space on this left-hand side and potentially create something dangerous. But it's little decisions like that that ultimately decide this kind of game for a team that will have low possession. With that, thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this content, please don't forget to give it a like. If there's something that you would have done a little bit differently if you were the Arsenal manager, please leave your tactics in the comment section down below. And with that, we're out.